Welcome to The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. Well, energy has been quite the conversation all around, not just the United States, but the globe, especially in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and absolutely the doubling of gas prices. Prices as high as $5, $6, $7 a gallon are unheard of. In fact, they're unprecedented. And so what is creating this havoc? Why is this happening? Well, I have with me today on my podcast an author, a writer, and environmental researcher, Steve Goreham. He is here to answer a lot of these questions all of us want answered about the energy situation in the globe and in the United States. Now, Steve, I've known him for a couple of years. I've had him into speak when I was a legislator. You should know that he has an electrical engineering degree from the University of Illinois. And he has an MBA from the University of Chicago. He is well educated in many aspects and well qualified to take on this. He presents a fresh viewpoint on environmental, economic, energy, climate, and public policy topics. And he has done presentations not just throughout the United States, but around the world. So, Steve, let's get started here. And I want to start with something that before we begin, though, I do want to also point out two books that Steve has written. One is called The Mad, Mad, Mad World of Climatism. And the subtitle is Mankind and Climate Change Mania. And then the other one is called Outside the Green Box, Rethinking Sustainable Development. We are going to be discussing both of the aspects that he presents in both of these books, especially when it comes to rethinking sustainable development. I do want to get into that. We may not have time to cover it in this podcast, but if we don't, we're going to have Steve back for a longer conversation on that. But let's get started here. Another environmentalist who has come to the realization that there's been a lot of hysteria about climate change is a man named Michael Shellenberger. And he wrote in Common Sense on March 1st, he wrote an article about the West Green delusions empowered Putin, which is exactly what we want to talk about, how the West Green delusions empowered Putin. And he asked the question about partway into his intro. The question is, how is it possible that European countries, Germany especially, allowed themselves to become so dependent on an authoritarian country over the 30 years since the end of the Cold War? And he's speaking specifically about how did they become so enamored with and so dependent upon Russian energy. He notes that Putin knows that Europe produces 3.6 million barrels of oil a day, but uses 15 million barrels of oil a day. Putin knows that Europe produces 230 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year, but uses 560 billion cubic meters. He knows that Europe uses 950 million tons of coal a year, but produces half of that. The former KGB agent knows Russia produces 11 million barrels of oil per day, but only uses 3.4 million. So he knows that they have excess supply and they're selling it off to Europe. So the reason Europe didn't have a muscular deterrent threat to prevent Russia aggression, according to Michael Shellenberger, and in fact prevented the U.S. from getting allies to do more, is that it needs Putin's oil and gas. Well, we're turning the tables on that. Apparently, the Biden administration has now come to this, said we're not buying any Russian oil at all, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So Michael Shellenberger seems to understand that Putin is energy rich and Germany became very dependent on their energy rather than developing their own sources of energy. You've talked extensively about why this is the case, but our audience needs to understand that this all comes from a perspective that they have about what is good and what is bad energy, and a perspective that I would argue, and I think you would too, is absolutely upside down. Could you give our audience a little bit of background about how Germany and actually Europe finds themselves so dependent on Russian energy sources, both oil and natural gas?
Well, great, Jeanne. Yeah, a big part of all of this is the green movement, the idea that we have to make a transition from hydrocarbon energy, coal, oil, natural gas, to so-called renewable energy, wind and solar and biomass and other things. And it has driven European thinking for quite a while, and it's got a pretty strong hold here in the US. Just last week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change who is sort of the recognized entity for the world, released the second part of their sixth assessment report from Working Group 2. And they also put out some press releases, and they said some alarming things. This is a quote from the IPCC press release. Human-induced climate change is causing dangerous and widespread disruption in nature and affecting the lives of billions of people around the world, despite efforts to resolve the risks. And in their report, they said delay means death. I mean, this is very alarming stuff. I'm going to pop up a.
Didn't I mean, if you listen to AOC, I think we only have 8 years left.
Yeah, that was
anything.
You said 10 years, a couple of years ago.
Oh, okay, so all right.
And yeah, there've been many alarming forecasts about that. I'm going to share a screen here about the IPCC predictions. Hopefully you can see this. This is a look. Back in 1990, the IPCC made a forecast in their first assessment report, and they said that global temperatures were going to rise a half a degree Celsius a decade. The worst case estimate, best case 0.3 of a degree per decade, and the low estimate 0.2 of a degree per decade. Those are the three lines on the chart here. And these were all based on computer models, but after 3 decades now, we can see that actual global temperatures are running below the IPCC's worst estimate. Let me go, the other interesting news from last week was that last week, the satellite data came out from the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and they publish this every month. They record global temperatures using satellite data. This comes from Dr. Roy Spencer, an advisor of mine. And the interesting thing about this data is that it's kind of flattened out. According to the satellite data from the University of Alabama, Huntsville, global temperatures have been about flat since 2016. And for the last 7 months, they've trended down a little bit. And this January and February of this year were cooler than the January and February of last year.
What?
So it is possible, despite the fact that the world is spending $500 billion a year to try and stop the planet from warming, that the Earth is actually going into a cool phase. And if that were the case, that would kind of interrupt all of the concern. So anyway, let's go back and talk about Europe a little bit and what's going on.
But Europe basically has bought into this climate crisis hysteria, right?
Have.
We know that the climate's been changing. I've learned a lot from you. The climate's been changing since the climate existed. I mean, it was what, hotter 20,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago.
Yes, there have been 4 times in the past 10,000 years, and this is for centuries each time when it was naturally warmer than it is today.
Right, and we don't deny climate change. We don't deny it. We actually just need to understand it. Correct?
I've never met a person who doesn't think the climate changes.
Okay.
The real question is what's causing it. So anyway, Europe has bought into this, and for years and years. By the way, back in 2018, the European Commission published a study saying there were 48 basins in Europe that could produce natural gas and oil if they were hydraulically fractured. Europe has decided to pursue none of that. They've instead decided to build wind and solar. And what we had this last year in 2021 is we had a very low period of wind. There was almost no wind growth, winds blowing in many places. And so they had to use natural gas to generate electricity. And so supplies got very short and the prices rose. What you see here is a graph of the gas prices in the Dutch market. And they measure these in euros per megawatt hour. And even before the invasion of Ukraine, you can see the end of last year, they were running at about 3 times the price of gas from the year earlier. And since the invasion of Ukraine, that's gone up to 10 times the price. And this is a tremendous negative impact on the standard of living of the citizens in Europe.
Well, can I pause you there for a minute?
Sure.
How does that pricing compare to Americans, what we're paying?
Right. So the US is much lower. We usually pay about $3 per million cubic feet. That's going up to $5 per million cubic feet. It's up about 50 to 60%. That has typically been half the price of Europe. Now we're less than a fifth of the price of Europe. So our prices are low, but they've gone up quite a bit. Price of propane is also up about 50%, which a lot of people use in rural areas in the US. And so we're seeing higher bills. And one of the reasons is we're shipping a lot of liquefied natural gas to Europe. The US has become the biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas last year. A bunch of that was going to Asia, but it's also going to Europe. So we're in much better shape. But as I was mentioning, Europe, 92% of households in Netherlands, 85% of households in England use natural gas. And those prices have just gone up by a factor of 10. So really a sad situation in Europe.
So, so that's why the Nord Stream gas pipeline, Nord Stream 2, was absolutely considered. But you know, they've bought into green energy. Are they waking up? They got rid of the nuclear plants. I mean, you could have seen this coming, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I've been saying for a number of years that people are going to learn the hard way. They're in shock right now. This is another graph that shows the West Texas Intermediate, which is one of the main prices for crude oil for the world. This is the price of West Texas Intermediate crude oil, which is one of the two main metrics for oil in the world. And you can see what happened in early 2020. That low dip is when we had the COVID crisis and global demand for oil dropped like crazy. US oil output went down. And since then, though, the price has been rising as demand has returned.
Wow, substantially.
And then with the invasion it's up to about $130 a barrel. So just another big impact. And the president says that he's not impeding U.S. oil production, and he's right in part. A lot of it was due to the very low oil price when COVID hit. But nevertheless, many of his staff members, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm, leaders of the left, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, many others, don't want people to use oil. They did cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. They restricted leasing on federal oil leases on federal lands. They put in restrictions on the ANWR drilling in Alaska. And the general posture of the administration has been to stop the flow of U.S. oil and gas. So there's an opportunity for us to go and produce more and share with Europe and reduce their dependence on Russia. But we got to get that started back up again.
So do you think that at this price point, it seems that we still have a conundrum here, and even the United States, where producers are not willing to go ahead and open up new wells and get fracking started again? Do we have a little bit of a limitation on just our infrastructure and our ability to move the energy to where it can be used by other countries? Is there a problem?
Well, it takes some time. So this is interesting. Back in 1970, the U.S. was producing about 9.5 million barrels a day, and that fell for over a period of 38 years, down to 5 million barrels a day in 2008. And then hydraulic fracturers found out how to get oil and gas out of shale formations by using horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And look what's happened to this curve. It spiked all the way up to over 12 million barrels a day in 2019. And then in early 2020, we had the COVID crisis hit. U.S. vehicle miles traveled in April 2020 went down by 60%. It was about the same number of miles we were driving in 1930, quite a big change. And so the price of oil went down below $20 a barrel, actually negative at one point in time. And so a lot of the activity stopped. So we went down, it's not really shown on this graph, but we went down from over 12 to about 10.5 million barrels a day. And then it's been slowly recovering. We're at about 11.6 now. And I think they're predicting a new record next year at well over 12 million barrels a day. despite some of the roadblocks that the Obama or the Biden administration has put up.
Wow.
So it takes time for these things to recover. You asked a question, there's some things in the way. It takes time for these things to recover, but I think we're going to get back to producing oil again, unless for some reason the administration clamps down on leases and other things. So this is a slide showing European gas consumption, the top blue curve, and the European gas production, which is the orange or brown curve there in the bottom, billions of cubic meters. And one of the big areas was Netherlands that's producing much less than it was. And so in 2020, 80 Europe's natural gas was imported, way up from 50% in 1991. And 40% of those imports were provided by Russia. And so they've become dependent on this. And as I mentioned before, they're not fracking any of those areas in Europe that could be producing natural gas. So they're trying to figure out what to do at this point in time. It's a big problem. Another thing that happened last week, I forget the name of the firm, but the second biggest fertilizer firm based in Norway, second biggest in Europe, said they're shutting down production.
Oh my God.
Well, there are many, many industries that are dependent on natural gas to produce, and they just flat out cannot make money. They lose money every time they produce a ton of fertilizer, ammonia, and so they have to shut down. So this, not only are households being impacted, but industries in Europe are being impacted. They're also going to have to lay off people. Really, really a terrible situation.
Yeah, it would seem the opposite should be happening, though, because Ukraine has fully admitted that they're one of the largest producers of fertilizer, one of the largest growers of wheat. And just today, here locally, Decatur, Illinois, a WAND article talking about everyone's feeling the pain at the pump right now, but farmers are facing steep prices ahead of the planting season. He says, we've really seen what the cost to our farming customers is really doubled. He said, and this has to do with both fertilizer and fuel. So you would think that a country that produces fertilizer should be booming right now, given the need for it. I guess that's not the case.
And again, I think in other places it's better. We're still producing fertilizer here in the US because our prices are 1/5 for natural gas of what they are in Europe. But yeah, again, this is a lesson for people. The demand for hydrocarbons, particularly natural gas and oil, is very, very high. Just some brief numbers: 90% of US transportation is powered by petroleum, gasoline and diesel from petroleum. 95% of Europe, 99% of aviation fuel is powered by petroleum products, and over 90% of shipping across the world, those ocean ships. So these are things that drive our economy. To think that you can do this with wind turbines and solar panels and even biofuels doesn't make a lot of sense.
But that's exactly where they're headed, right? So $1 billion program to buy passenger buses, according to the federal government. That's what's coming down there. Multi-billion-dollar programs to build out electrical vehicle charging stations.
Yep.
For people who don't use electrical vehicles, can't afford $50,000 upwards to over $100,000 for Tesla electrical vehicles. I mean, they are living in la la land, and it's unfortunate because they have bought all in the state of Illinois into the Green New Deal type of stuff. They passed major legislation last summer to essentially do exactly what AOC wanted, which was to get rid of the fossil fuels. And at the same time, there's no way that they can get rid of fossil fuels. I love this example, but to me, it says a lot. You have about 38,000 electrical vehicles in the state of Illinois. Their goal is 1 million electrical vehicles in the next 8 years by 2030. At the same time, they want to cut down coal production, which is well over 20% of Illinois' electrical production comes from coal. So how they think they're going to produce the energy to charge 1 million electrical vehicles is beyond me. It doesn't work. Nothing of this works. They talk nonsense. I mean, for right now, we do not have a good energy substitute for oil or gas. And could you speak to that? Could you speak to it? Because they want
Sure.
to talk about solar panels coming from China, that has almost little controls in terms of environmental safety environment when they produce these solar panels. And you have windmills, the same thing. They want to say that those are the answers, when probably for the most part the amount of energy it takes to produce a windmill is the amount of energy it produces in its lifetime. Plus you have this huge environmental disaster at the end of its life cycle to actually get to bury it.
There are absolutely other environmental impacts from wind turbines.
Why can we not
cells.
have a serious conversation about this? Why are they winning the arguments? Everything points to something different. What is wrong with the lack of knowledge for the average person to understand that I don't care, suburban mom X, Y, and Z are not giving up their gas dryers? What don't they understand about this?
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. Let's just talk about electric cars a little bit. I'm actually writing a chapter on that for my next book.
Oh, yay.
Electric cars have taken off in a number of markets because the governments are subsidizing them. We sold about 8% of the world new sales last year were electric vehicles. Most of those are in China. Many were in Europe. About 18% of Europe's new vehicles were electric versions, plug-in electric. US, it was about 5% or so, much smaller. But I don't know, these things, I sit back and take a look at them. If you charge in your garage, that may be great. You can charge overnight, you can go to work. But if you try and go anywhere, it's just very, very tough. But if you have to go charge, you can get about 62 miles of charge in an hour or 2 hours. And most of the chargers that are out there. So, to me, that doesn't make much sense. I could drive for an hour and it takes me an hour or two to charge to drive another hour. The chargers are the big problem with all of this. And we're trying to force people to buy electrics and to get rid of the traditional hydrocarbon vehicles. And we're going to put them through a lot of issues with chargers. Another problem is if you don't have a house, you don't have a garage, there's no place to charge your vehicle. There's no home charging overnight. Very, very tough. Another thing that you mentioned, Jeannie, was the environmental impacts with electric vehicles. There are many projections saying that half of all cars by 2050 or more are going to be electric. They want to ban them in Washington State. They've already passed directives in Washington State and California. You mentioned lithium countries that aren't very environmentally friendly, China, South America, Nigeria, same with cobalt, same with copper, many other places. Mm-hmm. So there's some big environmental impacts in ramping up all of these this transition to electric vehicles.
Well, it's and it's coming this way. So they just passed legislation in Illinois, in the Illinois House, and it's headed over to the Senate for consideration. And it essentially says that new residential and improved residential to a certain point must include electrical vehicle charging ports. And that's going to this is just nonsense. We're so far away from doing this. And it's something that shouldn't be mandated. It's something that the actual homeowner should decide to do it because they want to do it, because they have a benefit to do it. So they're just pushing this agenda, and they're pushing it especially in the state of Illinois, which is just, it's a problem. I think that the other thing that we don't talk about enough is that the electrical vehicle charge is coming from coal, gas, and nuclear. If you live in the state of Illinois, that's where it's coming from. And that is an additional subsidy. So not only are we going to pay Tesla owners a $4,000 credit to buy a Tesla, on top of that, we've been subsidizing the wind and solar that they think is also, going to provide the energy, which it doesn't provide the energy. Let's face it, it's a very small portion. In the state of Illinois, renewables are about 8%. And I think that's really a stretch to say that, but that's about what they are. But, when you look at taxpayer subsidies, the Committee to Unleash Prosperity, which is a Stephen Moore group, put this out just the other day, who gets taxpayer subsidies, and it has a nice chart. And this is just federal subsidies per megawatt hour. There's additional state subsidies as well. But when you look at it, natural gas and petroleum get about 54 cents on the dollar for a subsidy. Nuclear, about 46 cents on the dollar. Oh, I'm sorry, a negative 54 cents on the dollar, a negative subsidy. They actually don't get a subsidy. Nuclear gets about a 46 cents on the dollar. This is federal. Coal, about $1.04. Wind, $5.75. So you're talking about over 5 times as much as coal, and a lot more than that. And then of course, solar federal subsidies per megawatt hour, because that's how you have to do it, is $43.75. I mean, the massive subsidies upon subsidies for something that doesn't work and that people are not going to buy. When do we wake up?
Yeah, it's amazing. Government is subsidizing all this stuff. That's another thing about electric vehicles too. The business case for public chargers is negative. There's nobody making money in public chargers. The reason is that the slow chargers people don't really want to use, and the fast DC chargers are very, very expensive, a couple $100,000 to put in a charging station. And so what we're likely to end up with here is the government owning all of these charging systems, or paying big amounts to utilities to install them. It's opposite from what we do today in a free market capital society. It's very much in line with the government control kind of thing. You had some good comments about wind, solar. One of the things people don't know is the amount of land that these sources require.
Yes.
A professor by the name of Vaclav Smil in Canada, I've read several of his books, evaluated energy in terms of output per square meter. In other words, he took a look at all the land, the surface land, or the land, the area over an ocean that would be required to produce a watt of energy, or scale it up. And he included roads, and he included mines, and he included waste pits for coal and everything else, a complete analysis. But he found that wind and solar require 10 to 100 times more land area than natural gas, which is the best, then nuclear, and then coal. So anybody in their right mind would say, wow, if one energy source requires 10 to 100 times more land area to be occupied, isn't that the environmentally bad solution? And it really is. And I think people are going to start to push back. We're seeing that in a lot of locations now. People don't want to see their farm areas blanketed with big solar fields. They don't want to see wind turbines all over either. When energy sources are small, they can find a way to grow. And wind and solar at about 10 or 11% of our energy today, of our electricity, not our energy.
That's right.
But the idea to push them up to 50% is going to require vast areas of land. It's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, very good. The other thing that's not going to happen is that we're not really going to get rid of oil. Let's be honest. I was just looking through this. Products derived from petroleum include perfume, hair dye, cosmetics, hand lotion, toothpaste, soap, shaving cream, deodorant, pantyhose, combs, shampoo, eyeglasses, contact lenses. Let's get rid of those. Plastics. All right. All sorts of plastics, hospital equipment, IV bags, aspirin, antihistamines, artificial limbs, dentures, hearing aids, heart valves. Let's get rid of all of that. How about home products? Roofing and housing insulation, linoleum flooring, furniture, appliances, home decor, everyday kitchen items, dishes, cups, nonstick pans, dish detergent. All use oil in their creation.
That's absolutely right. Our big industries too that put out millions of tons of material every year.
Mm-hmm. And the other funny thing about this, Steve, is that there's a number of people who just want to just pretend like they could live without this stuff, and they wouldn't. They just never would give up some of these things. Go ahead.
Yeah, as I was saying, vast amounts of our industry, like plastic, steel, the biggies of the world use an awful lot of natural gas, awful lot of oil, awful lot of hydrocarbons to produce their materials, to produce steel, to produce ammonia, to produce plastic feedstock. And those things are basically irreplaceable, or it's going to take many, many, many decades to change them. A lot of people talk about hydrogen. We could use hydrogen fuel for everything. Unfortunately, green hydrogen is about 4 or 5 times as expensive. We have a lot of hydrogen now, but it's all made from natural gas. If you want green hydrogen, there isn't any green hydrogen, and the processes to make it cost 4 or 5 times as much. So we're kind of where we are, and people with a bit of common sense know that trying to stop the flow of oil and gas is only going to raise prices and cause shortages. And right now, Europe is learning a very, very tough lesson.
Well, and we sit here as, the #1 economy in the world, and yet we will deny what has made us the #1 economy in the world, that access to the master resource, that access to energy, abundant energy. And then we're going to deny it now to what third world, fourth and fifth world nations, just trying to get their people out of poverty. I mean, let's face it, energy has been the greatest catalyst to bring people out of poverty and to actually solve our climate problems. If you didn't have large water pumps that were run on natural gas, for example, you wouldn't be able to deal with rising sea levels like they've had in parts of the world. It's actually, I think it's a godsend, truthfully, that we have found natural gas and that our scientists have been able to capture it and use it efficiently. And I think that on the horizon, our scientists will develop that next energy. I just don't think it's going back to the 1600s and using windmills, but that's me.
Yeah, I think you're right. And as a matter of fact, if you look at it objectively, the one energy source that has done the most to reduce global air pollution is natural gas, by far. My grandfather in
Chicago.
Chicago.
Away here, though, in 2045. By 2045, there's no more natural gas. Replumb your your dryer to electric in the state of Illinois. All done.
Yeah.
We're done. No more natural gas in 2045. Get ready.
Well, I'm not going to do that. They're going to have to force me.
All right. Just Oh, and no more coal by 2035, but most of it going away by 2030. No more coal. There goes 20% of our energy, over 20%, about 22. So
people are going to learn the hard way. What this is going to cause is rising electricity prices and declining grid reliability. Interesting, within the last 2 years, we've had big blackouts in 3 of the top 6 wind states, California, Oklahoma, and Texas. And so they keep putting that wind and solar in there, and you're going to have more and more instability. And eventually, people, I think, are going to come back to reliable, low-cost energy systems. And let's work on real environmental, reducing real environmental damage, not the idea that carbon dioxide is a pollutant even. It's a ridiculous comment.
Okay, well, we're going to close it out here. Steve, thank you so much for joining our program. He is a native Illinoisan, educated in Illinois, and he is, right now, he is out of state. But when he comes back, we are going to host him, Breakthrough Ideas, for an in-person discussion about this topic. And the reason for that is because it is, well, first of all, I love the topic. I think it's interesting. I think it's important. But 2, the more information we get to people, the better decisions our policymakers will make. And that's what it's about. It's about driving prosperity for everybody. And certainly energy, which has come to the forefront. And then with the Russian invasion, now people are actually talking about something. We need to amp that talk up. So we're going to have Steve. Steve, you've offered to come in person and do a in-person presentation. And so we look forward to doing that when you get back in state.
Okay, great.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much
Jeanne.
for joining my program. We appreciate it.